Hello and welcome to another video from Toll Genealogy. And in today's video I thought we'd do something a little bit different. What I would like to do is once a month give you kind of a story time session, if you will. So I'll take you behind the scenes on some of my cases, or just tell you some stories about cases that I've worked on or cases that are of interest to me. So I thought we'd start with a particularly good one, which is all a bit strange and quite interesting / entertaining. Now the important thing to note before I go on to tell you the story is that anytime I'm going to use royal clients' cases, all names are changed. So you won't ever be able to identify who my clients are or who their trees are, because I'm changing names to protect identities and confidentiality. And even though this is a pretty historical situation, it does actually still affect people alive today. So yeah, it's important to respect people's privacy. So with that in mind, let's get started. So sometimes I do get asked to work on some pretty weird and wonderful cases, and the story I'm going to tell you about today is definitely no exception. This is basically a story about a man with two identities. So, back in autumn 2021, I was contacted by a man that we will call Steve. Steve's dad, who we'll call George, had both had their DNA tested through Ancestry DNA some time previously, and he had been contacted by a group of DNA matches, all of who were descended from the same person, and they couldn't figure out how they were connected to Steve and his dad, George. Now, he kind of looked at their trees and he couldn't spot anything in common either. He was pretty... he'd done his quite extensive research on his family tree, so he knew what it was. And he also had DNA matches that confirmed branches of his tree and confirmed the branch of the tree that these people seemed to share matches on. So Steve he thought he had some idea of how they might be connected, but he wanted to ask me to have a look to see if his suspicion was correct, basically. So Steve's father, George, was descended from a couple who we'll call Edward and Mary Harding. Now, George and his brother had basically been brought up only by Mary, their mother, because Edward had basically run out on the family one day in 1917 and never been heard from again. He literally seemed to disappear off the face of the earth. They couldn't find him anywhere. The police were looking for him for desertion of his wife and children, and nobody had any idea of what happened to him, basically, but he did leave of his own accord. That's all that they knew. Now, in Australia, a bunch of people decide to get their DNA tested, and they all descend from someone we're going to call Philip Bungworthy. Yes, that is a silly name. Again, it's a name I completely made up. Let's just say the original name that I have obviously changed, the original name was very, very unusual. In fact, the surname was so unusual that literally nobody in the entire world had that surname before this man turned up. So I've similarly tried to make up a surname that doesn't actually exist. If you go and Google this, feel free. You'll find that it's a surname that seems to appear in a short story or a novel or something. I basically just came up with a name that I thought was improbable and then couldn't find anybody real with that name. Found it was mentioned, yes, in a couple of stories, and decided to go with it. But yes, so the point is, this surname does not exist until this man turns up, and the only people alive today who have that surname are all descended from this man. So basically Philip Bungworthy only first appears in records in 1918. Before that, there's no mention of Philip Bungworthy or any Bungworthys anywhere. So Steve's theory was that potentially, as Edward Harding disappeared in 1917 and Philip Bungworthy didn't turn up until 1918, he thought that perhaps they were one and the same, that they were the same person. So Edward Harding, who also coincidentally was from Australia, but the other side of Australia, seems to disappear in 1917, and Steve's thought was, well, he disappears to the other side of Australia, reinvents himself as somebody called Philip Bungworthy, says he's from South Africa, and Bob's your uncle. That's why they're all related, because they're actually the same man. So I think you'll agree, listening to that, you can see it makes sense, right? It seems a bit like outlandish and not what you first jump to as a conclusion, but it's definitely possible, right? So that's what Steve asked me to look at, purely kind of considering the DNA point. So in order to do this investigation well as having access to Steve's dad's results, I also really needed access to people who descended from Philip Bungworthy. So very kindly, 3 of his descendants actually gave me access to their kits as well, so I could investigate thoroughly. And through that, I was able to establish that George, and therefore Steve, definitely did descend from Edward Harding. I knew that for sure because in this group of DNA matches. Now, the other crucial thing here is that all of those Bungworthy DNA matches all also shared DNA with the other people in this group. So they had to descend from not just Edward Harding's ancestors, but actually they had to descend from Edward's parents. I was able to tell that through the closeness of the matches. There was no way that they could descend further back. They had to descend from Edward Harding's parents. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they descend from Edward Harding, right? Because what I needed to do is work out how many children Edward Harding's parents had and where those children ended up. Potentially, one of those could have ended up on the other side of Australia. So obviously I had to do that traditional research to figure that out. Now, that was actually quite a short piece of research because they only had, I think, 2 children. Certainly they only had 1 child that survived to adulthood, and that was Edward himself. There were no other children that survived. So that meant they had to descend from Edward. The only other possibility for them to be sharing the DNA in the amounts that they were sharing is that Edward's parents would have had to have had another child together that was not documented anywhere on records. That was the only other possibility, and that's quite unlikely, right? Yeah. So far it definitely looks like Edward Harding and Philip Bungworthy are one and the same person. But I still wanted to do a little bit more research to make sure there wasn't any other weird explanation, and also just to see if I could find any proof that Steve hadn't been able to find as to Edward's later appearance on records or Philip Bungworthy's earlier appearance on records. And we knew, so Philip signed up to serve in World War One, and that's the record that states that he comes from South Africa. So I looked in South Africa, I looked for the relevant surname in South Africa, so that we're calling Bungworthy here. Absolutely no evidence that it was anybody of that name in South Africa ever. So pretty sure that that was not true. And South African records, incidentally, are pretty good. So even if I wouldn't have been able to find him, I would have found somebody with that name. But there was literally no one. And as far as the dates, they do kind of match. So Edward Harding disappears in 1917. He is mentioned on a record in August of 1918, but the record that he's mentioned on in August 1918 is basically the warrant for his arrest. And it's clear that he's gone missing in this paper record, and he's being charged with the desertion of his wife and children, as I mentioned earlier. And Philip Bungworthy actually registered for war service earlier that same year. So there you go. There were no other records. It appears that Edward Harding / Philip Bungworthy's, nobody knows why he ran away from his former life, why he changed his name, how he picked that name. There were some other weird, interesting things about specific features that he'd given himself, and it seemed like he'd dyed his hair and things like that. Clearly he was trying to not have himself linked with Edward Harding. I don't know, maybe Edward Harding had done something else, who knows. But he clearly did not want to be found, so invented this new identity. The truth is, we'll never know, because he took those secrets to his grave. So DNA can, prove the what happened, but it doesn't help us with the why it happened. So that just goes to show you never know what you will uncover through DNA testing. So let me know. I hope you found that interesting. Let me know if you've discovered anything weird through DNA testing, or if you are scared to DNA test because you're not sure what you might uncover. I know with my situation, I was a little bit concerned about what my maternal side DNA results might show because of, knowing the character, shall we say, of some of the ancestors in my tree. But yeah, I haven't discovered anything like that in my own, and this is definitely the strangest, I guess, situation that I've been asked to work on for DNA reasons. So yes, until next time, see ya.